70,000 people, that is the lower estimate. Some contemporary accounts go higher. One chronicler, Raymond of Aguilers, who was there, who walked through what he was describing, wrote that the blood of the slain reached the knees of the horses. He was describing Jerusalem, July 15th, 1099, the day the First Crusade ended, the day the city the Crusaders had marched 3,000 miles to liberate was taken, and the day that began one of the most systematic massacres of a civilian population in medieval history, conducted not by an invading horde with no cultural framework for restraint, not by an army driven by starvation and desperation, but by men who believed, sincerely and explicitly, that they were doing God's work, men who walked to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre afterward, still covered in blood, and wept. The weeping was real, the belief was real, the blood on their boots was real, and the distance between the stated purpose of the First Crusade and what actually happened inside Jerusalem on that July day, that distance is the story that most accounts either sanitize into a military history or condemn into a simple atrocity narrative without explaining how men who genuinely believed they were serving God ended up doing what they did there. This is the attempt to explain it honestly. The First Crusade did not begin with violence, it began with a speech. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II addressed a council at Clermont in France. The crowd was large enough that the speech was given outdoors. What Urban said that day, the exact words are not preserved, since the accounts we have were written after the event by people who were not present or who had their own reasons for particular versions, produced a reaction that Urban himself may not have fully anticipated. He called for military action to recover Jerusalem and assist the Christians of the East. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I had sent an appeal to Rome for military assistance against the Seljuk Turks who had advanced into Anatolia and were threatening Constantinople. Urban took that specific military request and transformed it into something larger, a holy war, framed as an act of pilgrimage, with spiritual rewards including remission of sins for those who participated. The crowd at Clermont responded with what the sources describe as a spontaneous cry, Deus vult, God wills it. Whether that cry was truly spontaneous or was orchestrated, medieval religious assemblies were not always as organic as the accounts suggest. The response it represented was real, something caught. Within months before the organized military expedition had even assembled, a mass movement of ordinary people, peasants, minor knights, the desperately poor, began moving east. This is the People's Crusade, a ragged, largely unarmed mass that moved through the Rhineland first, massacring Jewish communities in what became known as the Rhineland massacres, before crossing into Byzantine territory where most of them were killed by the Turks in Anatolia. The People's Crusade is the shadow that falls over everything that comes after. The officially organized military expedition had not even left yet, and already the movement Urban had set in motion had produced massacre of civilians and the collapse of any pretense that this was a controlled military enterprise with disciplined rules of engagement. Who went, the reality of the crusading army. The organised military expedition that left in 1096 was led by major European nobles. Godfrey of Bouillon from the Duchy of Lower Lorraine, Raymond IV of Toulouse, the most powerful and wealthy of the crusading leaders, Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince from southern Italy, capable and ambitious in ways that occasionally overrode the expedition's stated religious purpose, his nephew Tancred, Robert of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, several others. Together they commanded what military historians estimate at somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people in total, soldiers, servants, pilgrims, clergy, women and children who attached themselves to the expedition. This was not a professional army in the modern sense. It was not even a unified force with a single command structure. It was a collection of contingents from different regions, under different lords, with different interests, held together by a shared stated purpose that different participants interpreted in different ways. Some went for religious reasons that were genuine and deeply felt. Some went because crusading offered the possibility of land and wealth in territory that did not exist for younger sons in the rigid inheritance structures of Western European feudalism. Some went because the Pope's spiritual incentives, remission of sins, addressed very real anxieties about salvation in a religious culture where the consequences of dying in a state of sin were understood as eternal and concrete. Some went because the social and religious pressure to go in communities where the crusade had become the dominant topic of preaching and public life made not going difficult. They were not a monolith, They were not all the same kind of people motivated by the same thing in the same proportion, and they travelled an extraordinary distance under conditions that killed significant numbers of them before they ever saw Jerusalem. The First Crusade did not arrive at Jerusalem in weeks or months. It took 3 years. The expedition left Europe in 1096. It reached Jerusalem in June 1099. Between those two dates was a journey of roughly 3,000 miles through Byzantine territory, across Anatolia, through the mountains of southern Anatolia in winter, down through Syria and along the Palestinian coast, to the walls of Jerusalem in the summer heat. What happened in those 3 years shaped the army that arrived at Jerusalem in ways that directly affected what happened after. They besieged and took Nicaea, returned to Byzantine control rather than kept, which created the first significant tension between the crusading leaders and their Byzantine allies. They fought the Battle of Dorylaeum in Anatolia, a brutal engagement against Seljuk forces that the Crusaders won, but that cost significant casualties and demonstrated that the expedition's survival was not guaranteed. They besieged Antioch for 8 months. The siege nearly destroyed the expedition. Famine inside the crusading camp became severe enough that people ate horses, then leather, then, according to sources that historians take seriously, human flesh from the bodies of the enemy dead. Antioch finally fell through betrayal. A contact inside the city opened a gate. The Crusaders took the city, then were immediately besieged inside it by a relieving Seljuk army. In that crisis, a priest named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received a vision directing the Crusaders to dig in a specific location in the Cathedral of St. Peter, where they would find the Holy Lance, the lance that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. They dug, they found something. Whether it was actually the Holy Lance or a planted artifact or a genuine ancient weapon of unclear provenance, historians have debated this for centuries. What is not debated is its effect. The discovery and the religious fervour it produced contributed to the decision to sally out from Antioch against the besieging army. The Crusaders, outnumbered, defeated the Seljuk force. They were now in Antioch with a miraculous relic and a victory that had seemed impossible, and the religious intensity of the expedition, already high, was significantly elevated. By the time they reached Jerusalem in June 1099, these were not fresh soldiers motivated by clean theological purposes. They were 3-year veterans who had starved, who had watched their companions die in Anatolian winters and Syrian sieges, who had survived things that they interpreted through a framework of divine testing and miraculous intervention, and who believed, with an intensity that their experiences had forged rather than diminished, that God was directly involved in what they were doing. Jerusalem in June 1099 was under Fatimid control. The Fatimids, a Shia Muslim dynasty based in Egypt, had retaken Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks only a year before the Crusaders arrived. The Seljuks had held it since 1073. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, had prepared the city's defences. He had expelled the Christian population of Jerusalem before the siege began, a decision that prevented a potential fifth column inside the walls, but also meant that the city's population at the time of the siege and assault was predominantly Muslim and Jewish. The Jewish community of Jerusalem, which had been present in the city for centuries, which had survived successive changes of ruler across generations, was inside Jerusalem when the Crusaders arrived. This detail matters for what comes later. The garrison was relatively small. Estimates suggest a few thousand soldiers. The walls of Jerusalem were formidable. The city was naturally defensible on several sides, but the garrison was not large enough to hold a city of Jerusalem's perimeter against a determined assault indefinitely. Iftikhar sent urgent requests for Fatimid relief from Egypt. Relief was promised. It did not arrive before the walls fell. The Crusaders arrived before Jerusalem on June 7, 1099. They were in poor condition. The march south from Antioch through summer heat had been brutal. Water was scarce, food was limited. The initial assault on June 13th failed. The Crusaders lacked siege equipment. Their ladders were too short. The defenders drove them back. The army settled into a siege it was not well equipped to sustain. The crisis was real. Without timber, Jerusalem and its surroundings were not heavily forested. Siege towers and other equipment could not be built. Without siege equipment, the walls could not be taken. Without taking the walls quickly, the army would continue weakening in the summer heat, while the Fatimid relief force from Egypt got closer. Then Genoese ships arrived at the port of Jaffa. The ships carried supplies and, critically, the skilled craftsmen and material needed to construct siege equipment. Timber was found, transported considerable distances from the few forested areas available. Siege towers were built, 2 of them, large enough to carry soldiers to the level of the city walls. The assault was planned for the night of July 13th to 14th. Before the assault, the crusading army performed a ritual that the sources describe with a specificity suggesting genuine historical memory. They fasted, they walked barefoot around the walls of Jerusalem in a procession. They listened to preaching on the Mount of Olives, where Peter the hermit addressed the crowd. They confessed their sins. They were preparing spiritually for what they were about to do. The assault on Jerusalem was understood explicitly as a sacred act, an act of religious devotion, a culmination of a 3-year pilgrimage of suffering and faith. This framing, the religious intensity, the fasting, the barefoot procession around the walls, is not incidental context. It is the context that explains the behavior inside the walls. The assault began on the morning of July 14th. The siege tower on the northern wall, commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon, reached the walls after intense fighting on the 15th. A bridge was lowered. 2 Flemish knights were reportedly the first to cross. The gate was opened from the inside. The Crusaders poured into Jerusalem. What followed in the next several hours is one of the most documented events of medieval history. Documented precisely because so many participants wrote about it, because it was immediately understood as significant, because the participants themselves knew they were at a moment they would need to record and explain. Raymond of Aguilera, chaplain to Raymond of Toulouse, wrote that the slaughter was so great that the Crusaders walked through blood up to their ankles in the temple area. His account of blood reaching the knees of horses is the most graphic, and historians treat it as rhetorical exaggeration of a real event rather than literal description. The Gesta Francorum, an anonymous account written very close to the events, possibly by a participant, describes the killing with a matter-of-fact tone that is in some ways more disturbing than the rhetoric. Fulcher of Chartres, another participant chronicler, describes the killing and then moves directly to the religious celebration that followed, as if the transition required no explanation. What the sources collectively document is a massacre of the city's population that continued for several hours and possibly longer. The Muslim population was killed, men, women, children, in the streets, in houses, in the Mosque of Al-Aqsa where many had taken refuge. The Jewish population had gathered in their synagogue. The synagogue was set on fire. Numbers are genuinely uncertain. The 70,000 figure that opens this script comes from later Arabic sources and is almost certainly an overestimate. Modern historians working from population data for Jerusalem in this period suggest the actual population was considerably smaller, but significantly smaller than 70,000 still means thousands of people killed. The specific number is less important than the documented fact. Virtually the entire civilian population of Jerusalem, Muslim and Jewish, was killed in the hours following the Crusader entry into the city. And then the Crusaders went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They walked through the blood-soaked streets, some still carrying weapons, some still wearing armor, and they entered the church that was, for Christian theology, the holiest site on earth, the location of Christ's crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. And they wept. The accounts of this moment are among the most striking in crusading literature precisely because they immediately follow the accounts of the massacre without any apparent sense of contradiction. Fulcher of Chartres describes crusaders embracing each other, weeping for joy, going to the Holy Sepulchre and giving thanks to God. Raymond of Aguilera, whose blood description is the most extreme, also describes the religious emotion of the moment as genuine and overwhelming. This is the thing that is hardest to process from a modern standpoint. They were not hypocrites performing religious emotion to cover guilt. The sources do not read that way. The weeping appears to have been genuine. The religious gratitude appears to have been genuine. They had killed thousands of people and they wept with joy at having completed a sacred journey. These were not separate experiences for them. The violence and the devotion, they were the same experience. The killing was the completion of the pilgrimage. The blood was, within their theological framework, the necessary cost of reclaiming a holy place that had been in non-Christian hands. God had willed it, Deus vult, and they had done it at enormous personal cost across 3 years and 3,000 miles. The weeping was real because the belief was real, and the belief is what makes this harder, not easier to understand. A simple monster kills without feeling. What the sources describe at Jerusalem in July 1099 is something more disturbing. People killing with feeling, with devotion. with a coherent theological framework that told them what they were doing was not just permitted, but sacred. Medieval Christian theology had a framework for violence that had been developing for centuries. Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century had developed the concept of just war, the idea that under specific conditions, violence could be not merely tolerated, but righteous. His framework required legitimate authority, a just cause, and right intention. By the 11th century, this framework had been extended in specific directions. Pope Leo IV had suggested in the 9th century that warriors dying for the defense of Christians could be promised heavenly reward. Pope John VIII extended this further. The concept of spiritual reward for fighting enemies of Christianity had been developing for 2 centuries before Urban II's speech at Clermont. Urban's innovation at Clermont was to combine this developing theology of religious warfare with the pilgrimage tradition, the idea that travel to holy sites undertaken with proper intention produced spiritual benefit and could earn remission of sins. By framing the crusade as an armed pilgrimage, Urban created something new, not just a just war, a meritorious war, a war in which the violence itself was spiritually beneficial to the person committing it, provided the intention was correct. This framework did not cause the massacre at Jerusalem. Plenty of crusaders operated within it without massacring civilians. Military ethics existed. Sieges in medieval warfare had established conventions, including the right of a city that surrendered before its walls were breached to negotiate terms for its population. Jerusalem did not surrender before its walls were breached. Under the conventions of medieval siege warfare, a city taken by assault after refusing surrender was considered to have forfeited the protection of its civilian population. This legal framework, brutal as it sounds, was the operative context. What happened at Jerusalem was not outside medieval norms of siege warfare. It was an extreme application of those norms, amplified by 3 years of accumulated suffering, by the intense religious framing of the moment, and by the complete breakdown of command and control that typically happens when troops enter a breached city. Someone had to govern Jerusalem after the massacre. The crusading leaders had disagreed for years about who should lead, what form the leadership of Jerusalem should take, and how the gains of the expedition should be divided. Raymond of Toulouse initially had the strongest claim. He was the wealthiest and most powerful of the leaders, had contributed most to the expedition in material terms, and had consistently presented himself as the most sincerely religiously motivated of the senior commanders. He also had the most enemies among the other leaders. After days of deliberation, the choice fell to Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey refused the title of King of Jerusalem. According to the accounts, he said he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He took the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre instead. Whether this was genuine religious humility or a political calculation that the lesser title would produce less resistance from the other leaders and from the church, historians disagree. He had approximately 1 year to govern before dying, probably of disease, in July 1100. His brother Baldwin took the throne after him, and Baldwin had no objection to the royal title. The Kingdom of Jerusalem that emerged from the First Crusade lasted roughly 200 years in various forms, subject to constant military pressure from its neighbours and to the chronic problem that European rulers who might support it with soldiers and money were thousands of miles away and had their own problems. It was, from the beginning, a state built on the killing of its predecessor population and dependent on a flow of people and resources from Europe that was never reliable enough to guarantee long-term survival. Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187. In a conscious contrast to what had happened in 1099, Saladin's entry into the city was not accompanied by massacre. The Christian population was allowed to leave. Many were ransomed. The holy sites of other faiths were protected. Medieval Muslim commentators noted the contrast explicitly. Return to the beginning, before the armies left, before Jerusalem, before any of the battles. In the spring of 1096, before the organized military expedition had even assembled, crusading mobs moved through the Rhineland communities of Germany. They attacked the Jewish communities of Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Cologne, and other cities. Their stated logic, which was explicitly articulated at the time, not reconstructed later, was that they were on their way to fight the enemies of Christ in Jerusalem. Why travel 3,000 miles to fight enemies of Christ when there were enemies of Christ living among them right now? Bishops in several cities attempted to protect the Jewish populations under their authority, in some cases successfully, in others not. The massacres killed thousands. Entire communities were destroyed. Some Jews chose collective suicide over capture. The sources describe community leaders killing their own families rather than allowing them to fall into the hands of the mob. Pope Urban, when he heard what was happening, condemned the attacks. His condemnation did not stop them. The movement he had set in motion had its own internal logic that he could not fully control. The Rhineland massacres are not a footnote to the First Crusade. They are the First Crusade revealing something about itself before it ever reached the Holy Land. The same theological energy, the same framework of holy violence, the same language of religious enemies and sacred obligation, producing the same outcome in the Rhineland that it would produce in Jerusalem 3 years later. Not because Urban had intended this, he had not, but because the idea he had released, that violence against the enemies of Christ was spiritually meritorious, did not stay within the boundaries he had intended for it. Ideas do not always obey their originators. The First Crusade and what happened in Jerusalem in July 1099 cast a shadow that is still present in ways that are sometimes acknowledged and often not. For the Islamic world, the Crusades, beginning with the first, are not distant medieval history. They are a reference point, a formative experience of Western Christian military aggression against Muslim populations and Muslim holy sites that has been invoked in political and religious discourse continuously across 9 centuries. Whether that invocation is always historically accurate or proportionate is a separate question. That the events are real, documented, and have continued to matter in ways that directly affect contemporary politics and conflict, that is not in serious dispute. For Jewish historical memory, the Crusades begin not in Jerusalem but in the Rhineland. The massacres of 1096 are among the earliest major episodes of anti-Jewish mass violence in European history, and they establish patterns: the use of religious language to justify violence against Jewish communities, the failure of official authorities to prevent mob action even when they tried, that recur across subsequent centuries. For Western Christianity, the First Crusade sits in an unresolved position. It is simultaneously celebrated in certain traditions as a heroic act of faith and recovery of Christian holy places, and condemned in others as an embarrassing demonstration of what religious violence produces. The two responses are not easily reconciled, because the people who committed the massacre at Jerusalem were not acting against their religion. They were acting within it, within a theological framework that their church had developed and their leaders had endorsed. That is the genuinely uncomfortable fact that neither the celebration nor the condemnation fully addresses. Raymond of Aguilera walked through Jerusalem on July 15, 1099. He wrote about it. He was a priest, an educated man, a man who had been on the expedition from the beginning, who had witnessed 3 years of hardship and miracle and violence, who had found or helped find the Holy Lance at Antioch, who believed with everything he had that God was present in what the First Crusade was doing. He walked through the blood. He went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He gave thanks. He wrote it all down. His account is one of the primary sources historians use to reconstruct what happened in Jerusalem in those hours. Not because it is neutral. It is not neutral. It is written by a participant who understood what he participated in as sacred, but because it is honest about what happened in the specific way that a man writing within his own framework of belief is honest, not concealing the blood, not apologizing for the blood, simply recording it as part of a story whose meaning to him was beyond question. The blood and the weeping, the massacre and the prayer, the 3-year journey and the July morning, all of it present in his account. All of it present in the historical record. What it means, what it says about human beings, about religion, about the distance between stated purpose and actual outcome, is not a question the historical record answers for you. It just hands you Raymond's account and leaves you standing in it. If this is the history that deserves to be understood without the comfort of simple answers, subscribe. The past is more complicated than either the celebration or the condemnation allows.